I'm Olivia Clementine, and this is Love and Liberation. Today, our guest is Elisabeth Benard. Elisabeth is a professor emerita of religion at the University of Puget Sound. She is the author of Chinnamasta, numerous scholarly articles, and the author of the Sakya Jetsunmas, the hidden world of Tibetan female lamas, which we will be discussing today. She is a longtime student of His Holiness the 41st Sakya Trizin and Her Eminence Jetsun Kushok. I'm so delighted to have you here, and your book is incredibly in-depth and opens up a world that many of us have never heard about. Do you want to share your path to start with? How long have you been connected to the Sakya lineage? How did you meet your teachers?
I think it was in 1977 that I met my first teacher, Geshe Rinpoche.
Mm.
And there's a book written about him by David Jackson, the saint in Seattle. So the story is that I'm kind of looking for a teacher. I didn't know if it was Tibetan Buddhist, Zen, because Zen was very popular at the time. But I didn't really connect with any Zen teacher. And I had already met my future husband, Nyima Dorje, who is Tibetan. So, Tibetan Buddhism was kind of opening up to me. And a friend that I had, he told me, why don't you come to this initiation tonight? There's this very nice Lama, and maybe, you would like him. So I was a little bit worried about the word initiation. I thought it was a little cultish, and I didn't want to really go, but he insisted, no, 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 you should come. So I went. It was like in an art gallery in New York City on the East Side. I think it was maybe 10th Street between Fifth Avenue and Fourth Avenue. And it was after hours, so the art gallery was closed. And there was something, all these people were assembling. And then later, this old Lama came in and they were very respectful to this old Lama. And then there's some ceremony that went on. I really had no idea what this ceremony was. There was like bells and incense and some Buddhist statues. And I sat way in the back because I didn't know what I was getting into. And after the ceremony finished, I was ready to leave. But that was not what happened. As I was leaving, suddenly I felt this like kind of like a pull or a tug that I had to go the other way, like towards the Lama. And it was beyond my control. And I was being tugged all the way to this Lama. And as I was being tugged, I started to cry and cry and cry. And I thought, what is going on with me? This is nuts. But I had no choice. And as I got to the Lama, I'm like crying, and he's giving me this like fantastic smile. And he, blesses me with a Buddha statue. And then I realized that was the teacher I was looking for. And I felt very, very close to Geshe Rinpoche the third. He passed away in 1987, and the new one, the fourth, I don't know how old he must be. He must be around 30 something years old already, maybe 35. I don't have such a strong connection with him anymore. It just hasn't happened. But for the third, I was very connected. I loved him very, very much, and very wise man. And he just really, he was compassionate and wise. He was a wonderful role model to have. And through him, he introduced me to Sakya Trinlei and then later Jetsun Kushok. So I really met the two of them through Geshe Rinpoche.
And you've been now a student of both of theirs for some time.
Yes, yes. I forget when I met Sakya Trinlei, maybe 1978, perhaps, and then Jetsun Kushok a few, maybe in the early 80s. Yes. But their relationship with me is not the same as Geshe Rinpoche because especially Jetsun Kusho was a Lama for quite a long time. And Sakya Trinlei is Sakya Trinlei. There's always the 41st Sakya Trinlei I'm talking about, because now there's already the 42nd and the 43rd, but I'm always referring to Sakya Trinlei as the 41st. And they're very, very busy. So of course I'm in touch with them. I could call them periodically, but I don't see them every week for 2 or 3 teachings, at a center, the way I had like the connection with Daishin Rinpoche.
Yeah, that's so special to have that kind of consistency. And so today we're going to go deep into the realm of the Sakya Jetsunmas. And it'd be good to inform all of us about the origin of the Sakya school and when it was founded and by whom, and how is it different than the other 3 Buddhist schools?
The main thing is that in the 11th century, there was a lot of new Tibetan Buddhist schools emerging. Like the original one became known as the ancient one, or the Nyingmapas, and that started in basically the 8th century with Guru Rinpoche. But then in the 11th century, suddenly there was this kind of a revival of Buddhism, and then also there were people who were primarily males. I don't think too many females went, but going to India in search of teachers who would transmit different lineages. And so at that time, the Kagyus started, and the very famous relationship was Marpa with Naropa, that he went to India and he met Naropa, and then from Naropa to Marpa, and then Marpa, his main disciple is Milarepa. And then you also find the Kadampas, which now have been incorporated in the Galupas in the 14th century. But that started with Atisha coming to India and then starting those traditions, and then the Sakyas. So those all began in the 11th century. And then one of the Sakyas, his name was Kon, which is the name of the family, Kon Koncho Galpo. He had some students. He was Nyingmapa because everybody was Nyingmapa at the time. And he noticed that there was this one area of grayish white earth. And he felt that this was going to be a very holy area. And he said that we should build a temple there. And the story is that also Atisha predicted that this would be a place where there would be different emanations of the Bodhisattva of wisdom, Manjushri, the Bodhisattva of compassion, Avalokiteshvara, and the Bodhisattva of power, and Vajrapani. And so he did build this temple there. And then from that time, and this is in the 11th century, from that time on, that became known as Sakya. And Sakya refers to Sa, which is earth, and Kya, which means this kind of grayish white earth or pale earth. And so that's the name of Sakya. And from the Sakya tradition, one of the main gurus that they met in India was Virupa. And Virupa taught them the teachings of Lamdre. I mean, it went through a few different gurus from Virupa, but I'll just kind of fast forward that. And Lamdre became the most significant teaching for them. But Sakya Trinlei, he said that basically doesn't matter what the teachings are, all the teachings are about taming the mind. Doesn't matter which Buddhist school you're in, everything is about taming the mind. But these schools developed because of these lineages from one guru to another. And so for the Sakyas, the most important of these lineages was the Lamdre lineage.
Do you want to say a little bit more about the Lamdre?
I prefer to quote Sakya Trinlei so that it's kind of succinct. And so he says, Lamdre, Lam means path, and Dre means the fruit or the result. So it's the path with the result. And what that means is the inseparability of worldly existence, samsara, and enlightenment or nirvana. And so Sakya Trinlei says, there's no abandoning of samsara in order to achieve nirvana. As the mind is the root of samsara and nirvana, realizing this separability is the key to enlightenment. And so this shows the non-dual way of perceiving the world. And that's kind of Lamdre in a nutshell. But Lamdre can be taught quickly, it can be taught very slowly. And sometimes it takes over 3 months to give the transmissions for Lamdre. When you do the retreat, it takes 7 months to do. So it's such a significant teaching for the Sakyas.
Thank you for sharing that. And are there traditional paths that one takes in the Sakya school?
Yeah, the main thing is Lamdre. I mean, that's the most important. And Sakya Trinlei makes it a point to give Lamdre teachings, not almost every year, but quite frequently, so that it's readily available. And the main deity in Lamdre is Hivajra with Nyima, but then also Vajra Yogini is taught very frequently. But then she stands alone, and she has her own teaching for 7 days usually. That's the commentary for Vajra Yogini. So that's another very important deity that they practice. And then there's so many other ones. Right now, Sakya Trinlei is going to be teaching in Walden, as we mentioned, in New York at the end of June, and he's giving Vajrakilaya, which is another very, very significant teaching in the Sakya tradition. And this came from the Nyingma tradition and continues in the Sakyas. How it's different between the two, I'm not that completely sure, but it's very important. And I think the 7th month is completely devoted to Vajrakilaya, and the Cham dances, the Lama dances.
And so today we're going to delve into the Jetsunmas, the Sakya Jetsunma. So why don't we start with even just the term, like what is the meaning of Jetsunma, and is it only associated with the Sakya school?
Jetsunma means venerable woman, worthy of worship. It's not an exclusive term for the Sakyas. It's just a term that you can find in Tibetan Buddhism. Ma means the feminine part. But Jetsun is a very common term, like Jetsun Milarepa. Also, you would find this amongst the deities, like Jetsun Tara or Doma. And so it's an honorific term showing someone really worthy of worship or reverence. But what's interesting is that there's only 2 kind of spiritual families, the Sakyas and the Mindraling family, that the daughters are given this title at birth. This is very unusual. Usually you don't get this title at birth. And the other way that you get this title is like achieve status, is that through your efforts, through your abilities, someone confers this title on you. Right now, the contemporary Jetsunma Tenzin Palmo, the British nun, she received this title from the Drikun Kagyu head. And he gave it to her, and he said that due to all the abilities and your support for women to become nuns, she has a nunnery, which, she's always fundraising for, very, very dedicated towards, that she is given that title. So the 2 ways you can get the title is inherit status, such as the 2 spiritual families, or the achieved status.
And when is the first time we start hearing about Jetsunma lamas? What time frame are we looking at?
The Sakyas have a very extensive genealogy that started very early on, There's some as early as like 14, 1500s. But in these genealogies, unfortunately, there's almost nothing about the daughters. It's very, very hard to find things about the daughters. So I'm not quite sure when this title began, but it was only until the 17th century, 18th century then that I found something about some very, very specific women that were called Jetsumas. But I think from early on, they already had this title.
Yeah, it's just, it hasn't been annotated anywhere, so.
Yeah, that's the problem.
Yeah. And so one thing you get into in your book that was so fun to read about was the setup for Jetsunmas. Like, will you share about the traditional inheritance of a Jetsunma? Like what's expected of them? What are their roles? And then also their actual physical experience between the space they live in, the environment that surrounds them. Will you share about their world that they enter into when they're born?
Yes. So once I discovered that there were these Jetsumas, and they were the daughters of this family, and the Sakya clone family has existed since the 11th century, I was delighted because the daughters and the sons are educated equally. The Sakya clone family is foremost a spiritual family. And so they give the opportunities to the daughters and the son to be great practitioners. I mean, depends on the ability of the person and the motivation and the dedication, but the opportunities to practice, to have access to the best lamas are equal for both the sons and the daughters. And I found this quite extraordinary because if you read about a lot of the nuns in Tibet, they have such a problem finding food or being, supported, or the family, they don't want them to become nuns, they want them to marry, and the women don't want to marry and find this family. I just found it was quite amazing. And I consider them kind of like tukuls. I never found a Jetsuma that was a tukul, except this now contemporary Jetsuma, Jetsunma Kunga Trinlei Palter, who was born in 2007. And she's a reincarnation or a tukul of Khandro Tari Lama, which is quite interesting. But before that, I didn't find any Jetsuma that is considered a tukul, but they are akin to tukuls. And why I'm saying this is that in the tukul tradition, the labrang or their residents are passed from one tukul to the next reincarnation, and everything is provided for the tukul. And this is the same thing for the Sakya Jetsunmas. They also have their own residences. And there's two major families in the Sakya tradition, Joma Palace and the Phuntsok Palace. And both of them have about 5 labrangs for their daughters. And these labrangs were maintained one generation after another. If there were more than 5 daughters, sometimes 2 Jetsumas would stay in the same labrang. And with these labrangs, there were also attendants for the Jetsumas. There were animals and fields that were provided so that they would have their own income and they were not dependent on anybody else, to live their lives, but they were always encouraged to be nuns. I'm talking about in Tibet, not now, but in Tibet. If you married, basically you were asked to leave the area. But if you remained a nun, you could always stay in this residence for the rest of your life, and you would have everything provided for you. Jetsun Kusho is the eldest daughter of Sakya Trizin, and so she says, everything comes together. It is like being born in the heavenly desire realm where everything comes together. Servants, belongings, etc. Yes, so everything is provided for them. And I found this to be another extraordinary aspect of the Sakya clone family and their daughters and how they support them.
And about the land surroundings, they would have people that are connected to them that would work the land. So it would be farmed and then they would sell that and that's what would support them.
Yes, that's right. That's exactly right. And this would be kept one generation after the next.
And what was the encouragement for them to become nuns? Why was that encouraged?
Actually, it was almost more than encouragement. You had to be a nun. And because this is a spiritual family, so your main motivation basically is to help others. And they feel one of the best ways to do that is to become a nun. So you're not really distracted with kind of secular affairs.
But then the men on the other side were encouraged to procreate.
Since the Sakya Trizin is the head of the Sakyas, he had to have a family. And so then the sons were, yes, encouraged to marry, and they married into usually noble families' daughters, and they were encouraged to procreate, to have an heir. So this was important. But sometimes you read among some of the sons, some of them are, asked to be Sakya Trizin, and they don't want to become Sakya Trizin. They just want to live a very quiet life and maybe be a yogi or just be a monk. So it wasn't a given that every one of them would be married, but of course it was crucial that there would be sons to become Sakya Trinley at some point.
Mhm. And well, before we go further from the space, the labrang, I was really interested in the book about even just the practice spaces and even the term of using, for instance, they speak of rooms as caves to reiterate the focus on practice. And would you mind elaborating a little bit to give a listener an idea of even the layout of a labrang, some of the details?
Yeah, the labrangs really varied. Like Sakya is divided into two sections. There's this very small river, and there's the southern area, and there's the northern area. And the northern area was known as the tantric area, the northern. And most of the labrangs seem to be located more in the northern area, and a few in the southern area. So they were in different locations. And originally, Jetsun Kusho was going to be offered one labrang in the northern area, but she refused that labrang because it was too noisy. And so there was this newer labrang that was very close to the Dagmo Palace, which is where the rest of her family lived. What I could tell, most of them were about 2 stories high, and they had some, reception rooms, and then they had some shrine rooms, and they had attendant rooms. And I don't know how many people lived in a labrang. As I mentioned, there could be 2 Jetsunmas. Sometimes one of the sons would also come to help a young Jetsuma with a practice. There might be another Lama that would guide the Jetsuma during certain times of her study or doing a retreat or something. Less than 10 people for sure that would be living in there. But Tibetans usually like to live, together. They don't like to be separate. And Jetsun Kusha, all her life, she never wanted to live alone. She doesn't like that at all. She would prefer to be in a more crowded situation with her family than to live alone. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, it's incredible too, as you know, in your descriptions, the number of practice rooms, it seemed quite extensive, the space given.
Yes. I went to Tibet in 1983, and I went to Lhasa, and I went to some of those big Galupa monasteries like Sera and Drepung. The protector shrine, women were not allowed to visit. They were off limits. So it's interesting in these labrangs for the Jetsumas that they have their own protector shrine. And of course, probably some monk or attendant is helping doing the rituals, but they're considered as powerful lamas. And so there's no difference if they're a man or a woman in regards to this.
And going back to this differentiation between the path for Jetsunma versus a Sakya Lama, you write about how they did receive the same teachings. I mean, even like Sakya Trinley in the 41st and his sister Jetsun Kushok, which we'll get into later. They have the same training, but certainly their paths are very different in terms of what they're able to do, their ability to become lineage holders, I guess, for instance.
Well, Sakya Trinley were always males. So in terms, lineage holders could be like, that's kind of a very generic, broad term, but referring specifically to Sakya Trinley, they were always males. I never saw any of them that became females. But what's interesting is that sometimes Sakya Trinley had to, and I'm talking about general Sakya Trinley, not the 41st in this case, that they had to go to Lhasa and do some rituals for the government, or they went to Southeast Tibet to give teachings. And so during that time, a lot of times one of the sisters was kind of the Sakya Trinley, so to speak, when the real Sakya Trinley was gone. But Sakya had its own government. So though Sakya Trinley is the head of the government, there were a lot of ministers, and there was this head, the Shape. He did most of the administration for the Sakya government. So the Sakya Trinley didn't have such a strong political role as you might imagine. It's not exactly equivalent to the Dalai Lama's political and spiritual role, but they were considered the head of the Sakya area, and they were consulted, but they did have their ministers that did a lot of the work. And the women, as you'll see, some of them are in the guru transmissions of certain teachings. So I would kind of consider them lineage holders. I guess it depends on your definition of lineage holders, but none of the women became Sakya Trinzins. And I don't think that's going to change so quickly. Yeah.
There's been a gold lining to the fact that they can remain nuns because many of them are incredible practitioners and are gurus to lineage holders giving transmission. There's been some benefit to this cultural bias for them, maybe.
Yeah, that's a good way to explain it. Yes. Because they are, I think as nuns, you can really focus on practice and you don't have to worry about raising children or making money to support your family. Whereas you're going to see later on with Jetsun Kushok, when she immigrates to Canada, she has to work so hard. And people ask, well, how do you do your practice? she goes, I get up at 4 o'clock in the morning to do my practice. I have to go to work by 7. I don't come home until 5, 6. Then I gotta make food for my sons and I have to help them with their homework. So in Tibet, there was none of these obligations that they had to do, the nuns. And on top of that, even if they were not such good practitioners, if they kept a low profile, they were fine in the labrang. That's what they said. So they didn't have kind of the responsibilities as the sons who one of them would eventually become Sakya Trinzin, where it involved a lot more responsibilities than the daughters would have to have.
So let's delve into some of these Jetsunmas, beginning with Jetsunma Chime Tenpai Nyima, who was born in 1756. So what makes her unique, especially in terms of her relationship with the Sakya and Aropa teachings of Vajrayogini, and of course, anything else you want to say about her?
Okay, I kind of mentioned a little bit about the sources. This is the biggest problem, is that even though there's this very extensive genealogy in the Sakya tradition, all the chapters, except for one, are all about men, all of them. And this is like centuries of genealogies, and we don't have a single one about women, except for one. So it's very frustrating to find information. You have to read a lot, just to find a little bit. My husband, as I mentioned, Nyima Dorje, he was a great Tibetan historian. He passed away a few years ago. And he helped me too, because you almost had to scan extensive genealogies to find some information. So Chime Tenpai Nyima, she had a very famous teacher who was her uncle, Sachen Kunga Lodro. She was one of his main disciples. So I think a little bit because she had this good relationship with someone who was famous, that we find out something about her. But her biography, which is only a few pages long, is embedded in her cousin's biography, who is really not that important. So you see the frustration about finding this information. So things with her, I had to kind of infer because the information was so limited. It clearly says that she's one of the major disciples of Sachen Kunga Lodro, and that Sachen Kunga Lodro was one of her first teachers. You know that she's an excellent practitioner because she is one of the major disciples of Sachen Kunga Lodro, who himself is very well known for being a great practitioner and knowing very well the oral traditions, which means more kind of the secret teachings that's passed on from teacher to disciple. The other thing is that she taught more than 4 Sakya Trinzins because she lived for a very long time. By teaching the Sakya Trinzins, she also taught their families, the brothers, the sisters, the children. So she taught a tremendous amount of people. The final thing is that she seems to have a very strong connection with this important monastery, which is called Nor Monastery. It's not too far from Sakya, but it's a very famous monastery because she teaches a lot of Nor Lamas. It's one of the most prestigious monasteries in central Tibet. The people from Southeast Tibet, or come to Nor to do their studies. So you can see her importance in this way. And the final thing, which is the most significant, I feel, is that she's in 2 guru transmission lineages. This is very rare to find a woman in these transmission lineages. Tibetan names are unisex many, many, many times. Chime Nyima could be a woman, could be a man, you don't even know. And a lot of times in these Vajrayogini lineages, in certain teachings, there's no title. So it's just Chime Nyima. The people who are just intoning these guru lineages don't know if she's a woman or a man. But then occasionally, in some times, you get Jetsunma Chime Nyima. And actually, that's how I became interested in the Jetsumas, because I asked Sakya Trizin one, who is this Jetsunma Chime Nyima? This was at a Vajrayogini teaching, like in Walton, a long time ago, maybe 2008. It was a long, long time ago. And he didn't know himself. He didn't know himself. And he said, I'll have to get back to you. And so then a couple years later, I go to Rajpur, which is where he lives. And he says, I have some information for you about Chime Nyima. Then we found out a little bit more. And the other thing is that she's in the Guru transmission lineage of the partings from 4 attachments. And this is like a very succinct explanation of the entire path. I want to read this. Parting from the 4 attachments. If you are attached to this life, you are not a true spiritual practitioner. If you are attached to samsara, you have no renunciation. If you are attached to your own self-interest, you have no bodhicitta. And if there is grasping, you do not have the view. Sums up the entire path to Buddhahood. And it's only 4 lines, but there's commentaries galore all over in all the traditions, all the different Buddhist schools. And so in the Sakya tradition, she's part of that guru transmission lineage. So it's very significant. These are some of the major things that Chime Nyima is known for. I feel my book is a bit of a trailblazer, that it opened up things for people that perhaps in the future somebody else might be able to find more information about her. I'm hoping something appears, because sometimes it does. But she was just an extraordinary teacher and remembered for these transmission lineages.
Thank you so much for reading that and sharing all of that. I remember you writing specifically about her connection with Vajrayogini. Is there something in particular with her that's unique in terms of her relationship with the Sakya Naropa teachings of Vajrayogini?
Seems like a lot of the Jetsunmas are considered to be emanations of Vajrayogini. There's no really clear explanation of why they're considered to be Vajrayogini. I'm not sure, but I think it just indicates their power and mastery.
So let's speak about Jetsunma Tamdrin Wangmo. So she was alive from 1836 to 1896. And you write about how she was an incredible practitioner and, according to her paternal uncle, a manifestation of 100,000 dakinis and a prolific teacher, giving teachings to anyone. And can you speak of some of the qualities about her that stand out, and certainly any stories that come to mind?
Yes. Okay. So I mentioned that there's one chapter dedicated to one Jetsunma. The chapter is about Tamdrin Wangmo, because the grandfather of the 41st Sakya Trinlei, he's the 39th Sakya Trinlei. He wrote a supplement to the genealogy, and one of his main teachers was Jetsun Tamdrin Wangmo. So he wrote an entire chapter dedicated to her. And in this chapter, of course, he praises her tremendously, just as you quoted. And he also lists all the teachings and practices that she did. He lists so many that I didn't even include them all in the book, because it was just too much. And so she was an extraordinary practitioner, just beyond belief, the amount of daily practices that she did and maintained throughout her life. She was the second Jetsunma that taught Lamdre. Chime Nyima is the first one that I could find. And then Tamdrin Wangmo was the second one that I could find. I used the title Jetsunma, but Dagmo Jamyang Sakya, who is the wife of Dr. Rinpoche, and the one palace that I mentioned is in Seattle, the Phuntsok Palace. There's no palace anymore, but the Phuntsok family part is in Seattle. she told me I really should be using this term Kyabgon or Chapgon, which is protector, because Tamdrin Wangmo was such a strong and powerful practitioner that she should have this title. But she told me this kind of after I had already written most of the book, so I couldn't really change it at the time. And you'll see that we use this for the next Jetsunma. And lots of Jetsunmas, they were sent to Southeast Tibet to Kham. There were many, many Sakya practitioners in Kham, and she was sent with her a younger brother, Chokyi Longpo. And the first place that they stopped was in Jekundu. Jekundu now I think is known as Yushu. It's where there was that big earthquake so many years ago. And so Jekundu Monastery, one of the largest Sakya monasteries in Kham, very strict about women. No women can stay overnight. Even the monks, if they left the monastery, they shouldn't be talking to each other, so there'd be no gossip. And so it was a very, very strict monastery. But she was the exception because she was a Jetsunma and powerful Lama, that she was able to stay there. And she did a small retreat in this one particular room that later became a shrine. And people visited this room to receive her blessings. Her great niece, Jetsunma Pema Trinley, later will also go to Kham and will stay in the same room and then like even increase the blessings even more. So in this case, being a woman was not the issue. It was basically they were great lamas and they were able to stay in the monastery. And then they also went, the brother and her, they also went to Black Bull Monastery, a much smaller monastery, where they both gave teachings to the third Tukul there, and everything went very well for them. And later, Jetsunma Pema Trinley goes there, and she receives teachings from this Tukul. So you see how these, lineages kind of continue amongst the different lamas. But unfortunately, at the Black Bull Monastery, there was this major earthquake, and that younger brother died, Chokyi Longpo, plus the Tukul's parents and many other people. So it was a real tragedy. And one of the other Jetsunmas from Sakya had to come and help Pema Trinley with the cremation. And they built a stupa in his honor, because Chokyi Longpo said, if you build a stupa here, it might help to prevent any further earthquakes in the area. And later, Jamyang Sakya, she went to visit it in 1954. So the stupa was still there in 1954. But now I don't know if it still is. And it seems like there were no earthquakes for that time.
You tell the story about a Chinese womanizer. I laughed out loud at the outcome of this. Do you remember this story where?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, do you want to share it?
Yes. Okay, so Jetsunma Tamdrin Wangmo was supposed to be very beautiful. And so there was this Chinese official there who was known as a womanizer, and he wanted to visit Jetsunma Tamdrin Wangmo, not to receive any teachings or anything, but because she was so beautiful. And her attendants are going, no, I don't think it's a good idea. We're going to have some trouble with this. And Jetsunma Tamdrin Wangmo, oh, don't worry, I could take care of it. So he comes, and being respectful, he offers a white scarf, which is the traditional Tibetan greeting. And then suddenly he leaves completely frightened. So everybody's wondering what in the world happened, because they didn't see anything. But later, when he was asked what happened, he goes, I entered, but then I only saw a human body with a boar's head. And, of course, this completely terrified him and he left. But it doesn't seem like anybody else in the room saw this. It was only for him. And Sakya Trizin is telling me this story. And then he says at the end, of course she's Vajrayani. So they make these statements, but then there's not so much explanation why she's Vajrayani, but in this story, it kind of illustrates her power in that way. And Vajrayani is the deity with the boar's head, or sometimes it's like a human head with a side boar's head. But in this case, it was a complete boar's head. So she is known as Vajrayani. So she took care of herself very well.
So as you were saying with Jetsunma Tamdrin Wangmo, that her pre-name or honorific title was maybe more likely to be Kyabgon. This next Jetsunma actually does have this title. So Kyabgon Pema Trinlei, who was born in 1874. She was known to be a siddha of Vajrayogini practices. And do you want to share about her in general, as well as why she was given that title?
Yeah, so she did a lot of the same things as her great aunt, Tamdrin Wangmo. She did extensive studies and practice. I don't think she was as extensive as Tamdrin Wangmo in terms of teachings, but she did a lot of practices. She received a lot of teachings. And both of them also, when they went to come, I forgot to mention this for Tamdrin Wangmo, was they sought rare teachings. And they found a Lama who was qualified to transmit those teachings. And by doing so, they received the teachings and they brought them back to central Tibet, where they transmitted the teachings to further lamas. And so it maintained certain teachings which might have been lost, after a generation or two. So the two of them did this. And then later on, it seems like even though Tamdrin Wangmo, she was a teacher forever, she loved teaching. She taught anybody who wanted to learn. Pema Trinlei, after a while, I think she just got tired of teaching, or she also encountered prejudice being a woman. Like there's a story that she was sent to the northern plains, and this is primarily where there's a lot of nomadic families that live. And she overheard some nuns. This is nuns, not men, but she overheard, why are we going to take any teachings from a woman? And so she didn't say anything to them. And the Jetsunmas, even though they're nuns, they don't dress exactly like nuns. They dress what people would consider more like Bhutanese way of traditional dress. They have hair with little bangs and they wear earrings. They have a little bit of jewelry, but then they wear monastic robes. So in the story, when she heard that these nuns go, oh, we're not taking a teaching from women, she took off her earrings. And this is in a tent. So there's the smoke hole coming open. And through the smoke hole, there's these sunbeams. And so she hung her earrings on the sunbeams. That's all she did, which is quite a feat. And the nuns realized their mistake. And they were quite embarrassed by what they did and their statements. And so they kind of, hung their head in shame. And there's another story like this too. While she's in calm, there's a place of jurisdiction which nobody should be able to teach unless they were approved by the Galupa monastery there, and certainly no women. And so she's teaching, and the monastery decides, well, how could she do that? This is our jurisdiction. And so they sent the monastic police. They're called the dopes. And monastic police are supposed to be very intimidating, right? They have big padded shoulders. They're usually very tall. They carry like a staff. And so they sent the dopes, the monastic police, to stop her. They arrived at the place where she's teaching. She saw them, but she pretended she didn't see them. And so she's giving an initiation at the time. She's holding the vase, but then her robe slips. So she puts the vase also on sunbeam when she fixes her robe. So the dopes who are Buddhists see this and they go, oh, she's a Lama, we should receive her blessings. And that's what they did. And they never bothered her again. So you can see these Jetsunmas are very, very powerful and very skillful about how they handle certain situations.
Oh, I just adore those stories. I could listen to them all day. Really inspiring. And it was something else actually that really struck me about your book as you're sharing this is the mentioning of the continual offering of rituals that not only the Jetsunmas are offering, but also just the Sakya Lamas as well. That's such a huge part of their role as Jetsunmas is making sure that they really are regular with rituals. When there's rituals needed in distant places, they go do that.
I think this is how you maintain your relationship with these deities, is that you have to say that you honor them, you respect them, and to show that in one of the most materialistic ways is by giving offerings and doing rituals that either praise them or thanksgiving for something that is successful. Later, we're going to talk about Jetsun Kushok's aunt, Dagmo Trinlei Palter. One thing from very, very, very young age, all the way to her death, is she offered butter lamps and butter lamps and butter lamps, like whichever way she could offer butter lamps, she did. And then eventually, when they came to India, she would get red sandalwoods, which is quite expensive, as wicks for the butter lamps, so that was even more precious to offer. So Yes, there's a constant amount of rituals and offerings. Certain days of the month are dedicated to a particular deity, where you even do more emphasis on that day. Yeah, so this is all very important. And before I end with Pema Trinley, I want to tell one more story about it because it's very important. At some point, she decides to come back to Sakya and stay in a cave, not too close to Sakya, but not so far away. The two families have these two caves, and between the two caves, there is a place where the attendants can stay. She decided to stay in the Doma Palace cave, and Geshe Rinpoche, the one that I knew, the third, though at that time, when I knew Geshe Rinpoche, I knew nothing about the Jetsunmas. He was a great storyteller. This is one thing I truly, truly regret, that I did not know about the Jetsunmas when he was still alive, because he would have had a lot of stories. And he was a great kind of historian too, wonderful scholar. But anyway, there were two that were still alive that I could ask. And so Geshe Rinpoche III went with his younger sister, Ani Chitni, she has passed away, and his niece, Damo Jamyang Sakya, who's still alive, but she's like about 15 at the time. And so he wanted to receive the Vajrayogini teachings from Jetsun Pema Trinley, because she had received them from the second Geshe Rinpoche. So he wants this, continuity of the transmission. So they go to the cave and they receive the 7-day teaching from Jetsun Pema Trinley. Like Anichimi is quite young, Damo Jamyang Sakya is quite young, but they do remember that there was this wonderful rapport between Geshe Rinpoche and Jetsun Pema Trinley. And so it's obvious that Jetsun Pema Trinley is a great practitioner, but for some reason she decides only to teach, in this very private way rather than public gatherings anymore. So I asked Anichimi, what do you remember about Pema Trinley? She says, she can read your thoughts. She knows what you're thinking about. And she pauses when she says that to make sure that I understand how powerful she is. Her spiritual abilities are really quite extraordinary. And then I asked Damo, what do you remember? And she goes, oh, when she said things, it was as if she saw through you. She could see inside of you. She was not looking outside. And when I used the word Jetsunma, they said, no, you have to use Kyabgon. They're the ones who insisted. And all these Jetsunmas also learned divination. This was very important. And they were all very good with divination.
Let's talk about the sisters and co-wives. So let's begin with Dagmo, Trinlei, Paljor. So Dagmo, Trinlei, Paljor seems like she was the invisible strings behind her Sakya-kun generation, like her generation and the current generation. And do you want to share about qualities that stand out about her? As you do mention that the 41st Sakya said her practice exceeded those who spent a lifetime in solitary retreat.
That's true. That this Damo Trinley Paljor, she came from the Burnchill family, noble family. The oldest brother was one of the cabinet ministers. There's only 4 in the Tibetan government. And her youngest brother was a general in the Tibetan army. They had prestigious status, and she was part of this family. The Sakya family, they select the wife through dreams, signs, and everything. And so she was selected. But the brides, most of them, when they're brought to Sakya, they're clueless that they're going to be brides. They're just brought to Sakya, such as, let's go visit the temples. And then they arrive, and then they're told they're going to marry into the Sakya family. It's always secret. Now things have changed, when we're no longer in Tibet. But in Tibet, that was the case.
Was there a purpose for that, not telling them?
This is what Justin Kushok explained to me. She goes, we're a spiritual family. So these unions are spiritual unions. This is my explanation. She didn't say this part, but the male is seen as the compassionate aspect and the female is seen as the wisdom aspect. So that by combining the compassion and wisdom, then you can achieve Buddhahood. So this is how the spiritual union is understood. So Jetsun Kushok goes, oh, these lamas these days, they're so ostentatious and they have these fancy weddings and they have so many people. That's not spiritual practice. She frowned upon that. She thought it was really way too much, that this should be just a quiet affair and it should be done for spiritual reasons only. And so that's why it was always secret. Only about a month later, it was announced publicly.
But was there some significance to even the spiritual part of the woman not knowing? Because obviously the man would know what these dreams and divinations and things. So how come the woman would show up, have no idea she's about to get married? Was there something, or was that cultural again?
Probably it's cultural. I don't know why, because all of them were secret. Yeah, the men would have to know because, yeah, they're the ones that are doing the selection,
Yeah.
but not the women. Yeah.
And so in terms of the wife or Dagmo, the spiritual partner, when they enter into the Sakya lineage, what becomes their responsibilities in that role? Like, so for Dagmo, Trinlei, Paljor.
Dagmo is a title too, like the man's title is Dakchen. And so Dagmo Mo with the feminine ending. And it's kind of equivalent to the British lady of the estate and the lord of the estate. It's kind of equivalent in that way. And these two also, they're not mutually exclusive for the Sakya tradition that many noble families can have Dagmo and Dakchen. But there's a more specific term, which is Dagyum. So Dagyum, yum means mother. So that means a lady who has children. Now, Dagmo Trinley Palter, you're going to see she never had children, and her sister will have this title, but we'll get into that a few minutes later. She was a very dedicated practitioner, even from very early on. Most of these noble families, the girls would receive a small income from some land the family owned, and it would be like pocket money for the daughters. And usually most daughters, when they received this pocket money, they would buy nice clothes or jewelry or something like that. But not Dagmo. She used it to make butter lamps. You see, from very, very early age. It was one of her favorite ways of give offerings was to make butter lamps. So from a very early age, it seems like she was definitely spiritually inclined. She continued throughout her life, no matter what her problems were or the difficulties, she always practiced a lot. So she's known as a great practitioner. Adamo, though, they're not like the Jetsunmas. They're not given like go to your residence and just practice. No, Dagmo has tremendous more responsibilities, secular responsibilities. The first thing is to have the heir, to have babies. And then also they have to take care of this very extensive household. They do have managers and helpers and all that, but still they're in charge. The men are not really that involved, or the man and the wife will work together, but there's a little bit more responsibility on the wife than the man to take care of the household. She seemed to be an excellent administrator. She was able to handle so much at once. And she also had a very curious mind. She would always kind of try to learn different things. One thing is that Tibetans are very good weavers, carpet weavers. So she learned how to weave, though she didn't do that because she didn't have the time. But later on, when they're in exile, she helps the government set up a carpet cooperative, and she could supervise the weaving because she was knowledgeable about it. She was also interested in medicine. She learned a lot about medicine. She would make a lot of medicinal pills. So she had a very curious, very intelligent mind, and very, very capable in terms of handling many things. She has a very difficult situation. She is not able to bear children. So for 10 years, the Sakya family tried everything they could to have her conceived, but nothing worked out. So of course, she's very disappointed and they have to make a decision. And she's married to two brothers. And this is somewhat common, not that common, but you see this in Tibet. But Sakya Trizin and Jetsun Kusho, they usually don't say they had two fathers. They usually say the oldest one was their father, and the youngest one was their uncle. That's usually how they refer to the two brothers.
Do they relate to them actually differently, or do they relate to both of them as fathers?
I don't know, because the uncle died before Sakya Trizin was born. Sakya Trizin was born in 1945, and the uncle died in 1944. And Jetsun Kusho, she's young, right? She's 6 years old when the uncle died. So I don't really know. But I have to say that with my husband, they had the same kind of situation. And this was a way to keep the property intact, that all the brothers stayed in the same house. And so even though the children might know who is the actual biological father, they always called the oldest brother the father, and they called the other ones uncles. So there might be some similarity here too. So the family decided they had to find a new wife. And the grandmother suggested Dagmo Trinley Palter, she has a younger sister. So why don't we ask her to come? It'd be better than to have another family, and then maybe there'd be some disputes or they wouldn't get along so well. But since they were both in the same family, most likely things would work out. And so they invited the younger sister. And she's much younger, maybe around 12 years younger. Her name is Sonam Dolkar. Her too. She had no idea she's coming as a bride. Trinley Paljor said, "Oh, just come help me. I need some help in the palace. There's a lot of things going on." And so she came to help her older sister. And now Trinley Paljor goes, "You're going to marry the two brothers." And she said, "Oh, no, no, no." And Trinley Paljor goes, "And I'm going to retire. I'm going to become a nun." And so Dolkar said, "No, if you want me to marry the two brothers, then you must stay with me and help. And if you go off, I'm not marrying the two brothers." So it was agreed upon that basically they would be co-wives. But really the job of Sonam Dolkar was to have children. And so her first child was Jetsun Kusho, who was born in 1938. And then she had a young son a couple years later, but he died very quickly, like within a couple of years. And then she had another daughter, but the daughter too died, I think, when she was 8 years old. And finally, His Holiness was born in 1945. So, and it was very, very difficult to have a son. They had to do a pilgrimage. They had to do all kinds of rituals. One Lama, who was very famous for how efficacious his rituals were, had to accompany them for a long time. His name is Nama Naglo. Finally, Sakya Trizin was born, and the family rejoiced that they had a son. But it was very, very difficult for the family to have this final son. But very sadly, Sonam Dolkar died quite young. She died in 1947, and Sakya Trizin was only born 1945, so he really doesn't remember his mother at all. And Jetsun Kusho remembers her mother, but she wasn't that old either when the mom died. And the mom was a quiet type. So compared to the aunt, they had very different personalities. But it seemed they got along very well and they supported each other and they did the best they could. And in fact, Trinley Paljor, when Jetsun Kusho was born, she was a bit of a fussy child and would cry a lot at night and everything. And so Trinley Paljor took the responsibility to take care of Jetsun Kusho because she just gave birth to the mother and the mother was really quite tired. So she said, "Let me take care of the baby for you." So she took care of Jetsun Kusho even from the beginning, from her birth. And she wasn't able to sleep well, the aunt. And she would just take these cat naps because of Jetsun Kusho's fussiness. So from that time on, Dagmo Trinley Paljor never slept in a bed. She slept in one of those meditation boxes, and that was her bed for the rest of her life, except the last couple months before she passed away in 1975. This was one of the beginning ways that she always stayed in her meditation box. And it was well known that she had a lot of things near her meditation box. So she was able to help, right away if some situation arose. And so she took care of Jetsun Kusho from that time on. The mother dies 1947, and now their father dies 1950. So all that's left is the aunt. So the aunt now has to take care of everything, like everything. And Sakya Trinlei is only 5 years old. Jetsun Kushok is 12 years old. So they're still very, very young when both their parents have passed away. And so one of the big responsibilities is that she has to find the right lamas to train both Jetsun Kushok and Sakya Trinlei. And she's successful. One of the main lamas who taught Lamdre is in this monastery of Nur that I mentioned before. And he's known as Dampa Rinpoche. That's kind of his affectionate name, but his real name is Lodro Chenpe Ningpo. And he teaches them Lamdre. He also passes away after a few years, and then she finds other lamas to train them. And so both Sakya Trinlei and Jetsun Kushok go, if our aunt had hesitated or procrastinated in any way for our training, everything would have fell apart, because in 1959, they became refugees. And then everything was a mess. Some of the lamas that were very well qualified had already passed away. Some of them didn't make it out of Tibet. And so the timing was crucial. And in this way, too, she is regarded as kind of the savior of the Sakyas because of this insight and determination to find the right teachers exactly when he was needed.
Yeah, it's incredible how much she was managing between all the places in the homes, and then both of these children, future lamas, and just business. She seems like a good businesswoman too, and just kind of no nonsense. And I also really liked from what you shared that she actually really wanted to remain a practitioner. She just seemed really wholehearted in anything she was committed to.
Yeah, Jetsun Kushok describes her aunt. Yeah, I'll just read what she says. She goes, my aunt was a big risk taker. She was very direct, as many kampas are. In Tibet, things are divided into different areas. So the kampas, Southeast Tibet, they're well known as being very straightforward, a little bit too direct for especially people in central Tibet. And so she goes, she was a lot like these kampas. And also, she goes, if one was loyal to her, she was loyal to them. And she had a lot of compassion. This was very evident to a lot of people that I interviewed who knew her, how caring she was and how helpful she was, and how she always found some ways to alleviate some people's suffering to benefit them. So she had a lot of compassion. But Jetsun Kushok continues, however, if someone wanted to compete with her, she was tough and wouldn't give up. And if someone wanted to hurt her or put her down, she fought back. My aunt was a formidable woman. So yes, she was very, very strong in her presence. And Gene Smith, who collected all the Buddhist texts, he met the aunt and he said, oh, she was tough. And at the time, I know in India, she was very protective of Sakya Trinlei because she really wanted him to be well grounded in the Sakya tradition and to become a really good Lama, because there was a lot of temptation for these younger lamas to go to the West, and some disrobed and some married. And so she protected him very well, especially, Westerners, what were their motivations about Sakya Trinlei and what did they want out of him? She was known as someone who was fierce and a very strong protector as well.
I want to mention that we're not speaking of really the vast background of all of these Jetsunmas. I mean, the amount of practice they each do. And if somebody wants to know all the different practices, it's in your book, because I just realized as a listener is probably hearing this, they're not hearing the depth of practice each of these Jetsunmas have, how steeped they are, how it's the core of their life.
Yeah, that's good. Yeah, that's important. Yes.
So we're speaking of other parts of their life, but at the center of it, many of these Jetsunmas are going around doing ritual offerings or staying rooted in their labrangs and practicing. Before we actually go into Jetsun Kusho, I wanted to take a slight detour to Jetsunma Chungwa. I found her very interesting. You only mentioned her a little moment in your text.
Yes.
She was considered mute because she was so focused on her practice, and she'd only speak to her older sister and an old nun who was her attendant. And one thing I was curious about was you talk about her death. When the Chinese invaded, she was forced to leave her living quarters on the second floor of her labrang. and go downstairs in the shrine room, the Mahakala shrine room. And then she found out that they were going to remove her completely from the labrang. And then she died in that protector shrine room in 1962. And do you know why she actually died?
This is one of Jetsun Kusho's paternal aunts. And Jetsun Kusho was surrounded by aunts and women practitioners. This is something that people don't realize, how the Sakya family had many, many practitioners constantly in the household doing all kinds of these rituals and meditations and daily practices. And so she's called, the little one because she's the youngest. Chungwa just means little. As you mentioned, yes, everybody thought she was mute because she didn't talk, except for to her older sister and her attendant. But she was a very highly realized practitioner, but she wanted to keep it quiet. She was humble. She didn't want to say anything about it. But we can see from her death how great her practice is, because in 1959, things fell apart. Many people are leaving Tibet. Auntie Jetsun Kusho and His Holiness leave in 1959. So now the people who are remaining in Tibet, especially if they're from the Sakya family or one of these aristocratic families, the Chinese government officials are going to try to destroy them in any way possible, bring down those imperialist forces or those forces of oppression. And so anybody who was from a noble family was an oppressor. And this is not directly related to Jetsun Chungwa, but I once spoke to one of the attendants of one of the Jetsumas from the Phuntsok Podrong. And he started to tell me the story, and then he completely broke down because this Jetsuma now was being dragged by her hair in the street, and people were supposed to kick her and spit on her. See, they really, really terrible, terrible things that these people had to endure. And so I'm sure this Jetsunma Chungwa knew that either this would be her fate or she would be imprisoned and tortured. So she decided to leave her body. It was a conscious death, let's put it that way. Mm-hmm. They have great abilities, and so she directed her consciousness outside her body.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So this is actually a good transition as well, because Jetsun Kusho, who was born in 1938, and her brother, the 41st Sakya Trinlei, we can move into their life. Jetsun's interesting because right now she's in her late 80s, maybe 86. And she's the first Jetsunma that you write about who was raised between worlds. So she was raised in Tibet to receive the full practice education of her predecessors, steeped in her home. And then she also was part of the 1959 exile. And so soon after she became a householder. So do you want to speak about her, like some of the qualities that make her stand out? You also know her.
Yes. I know her very well. And this book could not have happened if it wasn't through the generosity of their time and information that they gave me. I mean, it took years and years to interview them because they were very busy and not here or not there. But both of them gave me so many interviews, and it was really through them that I was able to put this book together. So when they were in Tibet, they studied together, they received the same teachings, they did retreats together. So they were very close in that way. But I would say that they remain close to this day, because Jetsun Kusho would try to go every New Year's back to India to spend time with the family. And also if Sakya Trinlei came to the United States, he would always try to come and visit him. And now her health is not so good. So now Sakya Trinlei in August is going to Vancouver, and he's giving teachings, but I know the first reason that he's going is to see his sister. So they're maintaining this relationship throughout their lives. It's really quite beautiful to see this love between the two of them and how much they care and respect each other. So in Tibet, they received all the same teachings. They did the retreats. And when Sakya Trinlei, what was it, 1955, so he's like 10 years old, some people arrived from Kham and they want him to teach Lamdre. But at the time, he was undergoing a retreat for Vajrakilaya, the protector deity. And so Auntie, who, as I said, very intelligent and knew the Sakya history, said, Jetsun Kusha, she didn't call it Jetsun Kusha, her name is Chime La, you can give Lamdre. And so Jetsun Kusha gives Lamdre to these Kampas who arrive. Let's see, how old is she? She's 17 years old. Very, very young, right? To give such an important teaching to a group of people. She turns out to be the youngest Jetsunma who taught Lamdre. Later, she doesn't teach Lamdre anymore that I can remember, but she did that in Tibet. They both go to Lhasa twice. First time is in 1951, where the Dalai Lama designates Sakya Trinlei as the next Sakya Trinlei. And then they go back in 1956 and they receive teachings from Dzongtsar Khyentse. And then they also meet him in exile in Sikkim in 1959. So they do many things together. They do a pilgrimage to India in 1956, 57. And there's this other book that's really great. It's called A Promise Kept. They met this a woman called Tremaine Gruel, who was a photographer, but somehow she started to get involved with seeing Sakya Trinlei, and they developed this tremendous relationship. And then she developed this very, very close relationship with Jetsun Kusha in India. And she keeps a journal of all of this, but she's not able to write the book before she dies. So she gives it to her friend, Marilyn, who writes the book, which is called The Promise Kept. She explains so much about their early life in India. She describes in the book their pilgrimage. And this is something we didn't talk about Jetsun Kusha, but Jetsun Kusha, she likes to be a tomboy. And she liked to get dressed up as a monk. And then even when one time when they went to see the Dalai Lama, he was giving a big Chenrezi initiation in the summer palace, Norbalinka. They think that she's one of the sons of the Sakyas, and she pretends she is, and she gets her special place. She had a little bit of that nature too, kind of tough. You don't mess around with Jetsun Kusha, a little bit like her aunt.
If I remember this correctly, she received her first practice at the age of 10 and then went into retreat.
Yes, for 1 month.
As you're speaking of Jetsun Kushok now going to Lhasa, they stayed for like 4 months or longer, and they're just doing tons of rituals in many different places or receiving transmissions, giving transmissions.
That's right. It's all about practice and transmissions. Yes, absolutely. Jetsun Kusho at 10 years old did her first 1 month meditation on Vajrapani. Usually they start with Vajrapani because you get rid of obstacles. So this is a good one to begin with. And then at 11 years old, she's sent to the northern plains, like these nomadic places, to give a very particular empowerment of long life to the nomads. And she has one aunt with her, a couple of attendants, and some monks who have to do the rituals, like the musical instruments and other rituals. But at 11 years old, she's going all over the northern plains to give this empowerment and to collect donations. And the reason that she sent is that the great temple was hit by lightning, so they had to raise money. And the other family, the Phuntsok palace, the Sakya Trinlei in charge at that time. And so his family had to collect a lot of money as well, but there still wasn't enough. And so he asked the help of the Doma palace to do this. And since she was the only child, at the time, basically, because Sakya Trinlei is not even born, she must go on behalf of her family to collect those donations. And she did. She was very, very successful. And she said that she was so happy that she did that and that nothing was wasted. And this is at 11 years old. Unbelievable.
Also, some of the descriptions you have of when her and her family are in Tibet during those years, the abundance of nature and the vastness of the land, how it's not owned by anybody, right? Like nomads are just kind of moving around the landscape. That was really touching to read about.
Yeah, like when I asked Jetsun Kusha what was her first memory, she told me the pilgrimage that her family had taken to have a son. And that was in 1944. And one of the first places they went to was along the plains to Mount Kailash. And she said it was just so beautiful. There was the vastness of the land, the vastness of the sky. There were ducks that she had never seen before. There were the wild yaks, the antelopes. And when she described this to me, it was really like she was remembering this. It was almost like a dreamlike state that she was in. And she was so young that she rode with her nanny. And then she had her younger sister at that time too, who was just born, which was incredible that they took such a young baby with them on this long, long pilgrimage, all on horseback. And that her mother was a great rider, her aunt was a great rider, and the mother was such a great rider that one time the aunt is saying all her mantras, because the plains are a long, long time, that she was almost dropping her rosary on the ground, and her mother just galloped, alongside the aunt, got the rosary and put it back over the head of her aunt. So,
Their aunt was kind of
beautiful.
falling asleep after the long journey, or
Yeah, that's right. And then every night, as you mentioned, the rituals, they always said the praises to 21 Taras. They never went to bed without saying those praises. And this is an important praise that continues. A lot of times when you ask Sister Kusha, what should I do? She goes, say the prayers of the 21 Taras. And so as they're going on this pilgrimage, they need to get more merit. And the young son had already passed away. The uncle had just passed away. So they were making merit for the two of them who had passed away, plus trying to get a son, another son. And so they did rituals everywhere that they went.
and this is actually a little bit earlier in time, but you tell the story about the aunts when they're on pilgrimage and Jamyan Kensi Choki Lodro
Yes.
overhears them. Do you want to share that story?
Those aunts, they went to the holy area of Samye, the paternal aunts of Jetsun Kusho, the older ones, and they wanted to keep a low profile and they didn't say anything. They didn't want people to come up and, and, oh, the Jetsumas, the Sakya Jetsunmas, we better do something for them and everything. And so everybody's traveling in their own tents, right? That's how they would travel. And so Choki Lodro, he's nearby and he hears what they're chanting in the tent. And they're doing a Vajra ritual. So he knows not that many people do a Vajra ritual. So he was sure they had to be someone special. So he goes into the tent and right away he recognizes them as the Sakya Jetsunmas. And he offers his respect. And so they're a little shy about all of this, but of course they're gracious as well. And they offer respects to him too. So mutual respect among great practitioners.
And later on, his consort becomes very close friends with Jetsun Kusho.
Yeah, so in 1956, Jetsun Kusho and His Holiness received teachings in Lhasa from him. And so he already has his consort, Khandro Siring Churden. So, Jetsun Kusho is not that old. Khandro Siring Churden is not that old. So they become friends. And then as he's basically escaping to Sikkim, he stops in Sakya and he gives even further teachings there. And then once again, Khandro Siring Churden and Jetsun Kusho reunite, and that's all I know about their relationship. She said they sang songs, and I said, spiritual songs? No, just regular songs, And so I never got more information from her.
And so then when Jetsun Kusho has to leave Tibet with her family, it sounds like she has a couple different times where she has an identity crisis, essentially going from being a nun to then not knowing what to be in India. And then also when she transitions from India to the West, that's a huge transition of lifestyle as well. And It sounds like she was perfectly happy in India by the time she settled in and had a life there. What was the pull to go to the West?
When they first arrived in India, it was very, very difficult. First, they went to Sikkim, and Sikkim was not so bad because most of them are Tibetan Buddhists there. So the transition is not so radical. They would recognize Jetsun Kusho as a nun. But then when they went to India, the only women who normally have shaved heads are widows. In 1959, to be a widow was highly, highly inauspicious. They couldn't attend many things if you were a widow. So even though Jetsun Kusho was quite young looking, she was still regarded as someone inauspicious by Indians.
So she didn't have the Bhutanese cut.
No, she had that kind of more shaped head. She liked to be like kind of like a boy. When they went on that pilgrimage in 1956, they were at a train station. This is the very first train they ever had taken in their entire lives. And in India, you have to wait for the train quite a long time. And so there was the ladies' waiting room, which are only for ladies. So her aunt and her an attendant enter the ladies' room. Now, they don't know any Hindi, they don't know any English. And the Indian women are starting to shriek and yell, and they're clueless. What's going on? Why are we getting such a reaction? And then finally, they start to point to Jetsun Kusho. And Jetsun Kusho, she has the shaved head, she has pants and the chupa, the overcoat. Looks like a man to them. Finally, they realized this is what the problem was. So Jetsun Kusho had to take off her overcoat and show the Indian women that she had breasts, that she was a woman. And finally, they calmed down. But a lot of times they thought she was a boy. And I think Jetsun Kusho kind of enjoyed almost teasing people that way. And she said her aunt really wasn't too pleased with this, but she couldn't control her.
It sounded like the aunt felt like the minute she landed in India, she became quite rebellious.
It really took off in India.
Yeah.
Because now she's really out of sorts, Jetsun Kusho. There's no nunneries. There's hardly any money to support anybody. So all the attention is on Sakya Trizin because he's the head of the Sakyas. So they look for teachers for Sakya Trizin. Jetsun Kusho, she can kind of join, but she isn't pushed in the same way as she was in Tibet. And she's feeling uncomfortable. People are looking at her in a negative way. And she decides that it's best to disrobe. So she disrobes. She starts to wear blue jeans. I heard she's wearing kind of short skirts sometimes. She's rebelling. And then the people who know that she's still Jetsun Kusho want to honor her, prostrate to her and everything. And now she's completely embarrassed because she's not appropriately dressed in this way. So there's a lot of conflicts for Jetsun Kusho in India, whereas the status of Sakya Trizin really basically stayed the same.
That was actually quite heartbreaking to read, considering how unified they are together. They seem to have such a solid relationship, and they've really practiced their whole life together, received all the same transmissions. And then he arrives, and it's like he gets to kind of continue as usual. Of course, I'm sure there's a lot in his process as well. I mean, with the whole exile from Tibet, but then she has to completely decide how to live her life from that moment forward. I can't quite imagine being in that position.
Yes. There's a radical separation in terms of their status and how they're treated. It's very true. And Sakya Trizin too, even physically, even though he has long hair, in India, there's a lot of sadhus that have long hair, so it's not such a big deal. But Jetsun Kusho, either she looks like this inauspicious widow type person, or now she's just like any other young Tibetan girl who's running the streets. She loves the cinema. She goes with her cousin Lama Kunga. Actually, that's how she learned Hindi. But one thing that Sakya Trizin was very insistent to Jetsun Kusho is you have to learn English. So she found a missionary. They were living now in Darjeeling. She found a missionary and she was studying English. And then they found out that if they went to church on Sunday, they wouldn't even have to pay the missionary to learn English. So then Sakya Trizin tells Jetsun Kusho, maybe you should go to church and you tell me what they say so that we become more familiar with how these Westerners think. So Jetsun Kusho goes to church. At the time, there's another Tibetan there, Sek Kusho, who eventually becomes her husband. So now the aunt is thinking, what could Jetsun Kusho do? We should help the government in some way. The aunt's youngest brother, the one that was an army general, now he's based in Dharamsala, and he's serving the Tibetan government. So she goes, Jetsun Kusho, maybe you should do that too. And so she sends her to this place where she's supposed to be a nurse to help the children. But Jetsun Kusho said it was a glorified childcare place. Sanitation was very poor, that she got quite sick, and then eventually she was brought back home. So in this book, The Promise Kept, Tremaine Gruel, the person who knows Jetsun Kusho, it seems by the time she meets Jetsun Kusho's already married and already has 2 sons. And so now the whole family has moved to Missouri, which is one of the beautiful hill towns in India, is that it's closer to Dharamsala, which is where the Dalai Lama is based. And also it's more accessible from Delhi. So they end up in Missouri. A lot of other Tibetans end up there. There's a big Tibetan children's village there. And they stay there for quite a few years. And Jermaine Gruel describes their living situation. Sounds not that good at all. So in one place, there's His Holiness and the auntie. Then there's Jetsun Kusho, her husband, and her 2 children, a few attendants. And then there's Luden Ken Rinpoche, because Jetsun Kusho's husband is Sek Kusho, but he's the younger brother of Luden Ken Rinpoche, who's a senior Lama, a very, very important Sakya Lama. He just died 1 or 2 years ago. And as I mentioned, she always likes to be with her family. Doesn't matter how crowded, how uncomfortable it is, she always preferred to be in this kind of situation. But Tremaine Gruel, who was really cosmopolitan traveler, she lived in Thailand for many years. She knew many, many people. She knew the Canadian ambassador. She told Jetsun Kusho, you really shouldn't live in this kind of situation. I think it'd be better if you go to Canada and raise your sons in Canada. Jetsun Kusho arrives in Canada. I don't think it was her first choice. If she was allowed, she'd probably stay in India despite the financial difficulties and the physical discomforts. And she had TB for a while. I mean, things were not that easy for her, but still she liked being with her family. But it was arranged. So Sek Kusho and Jetsun Kusho and the 3 sons now are moving to Canada. And they had a very tough time because nobody knows them. They're just some refugees, and the government doesn't give you really much money. Then they were sent to a farm, and Sek Kusho had to do a lot of hard manual work. And she had 4 children.
During that time.
She had a daughter who passed away, I think when she was less than 2. Eventually, they came to Vancouver, but again, they had to do more manual work. They both worked on a mushroom farm, and they realized they had to do something else. So eventually, Jetsun Kusho found a job with a designer, and she was a weaver amongst a few other Tibetans. And Jetsun Kusho, just like her auntie, even though she never learned how to weave in Sakya, she did observe how they did weaving, and she learned how to do this.
What was the time frame between becoming a householder and then starting to then teach again? How long was that gap?
It was a while. She kind of stayed hidden, She taught a few people very privately, but even amongst the Tibetans, a lot of them weren't even aware of who she was. So she was very quiet. But Sakya Trizin, I forget the first time he came to the United States. When was that?
70s?
Yeah, in the 70s. So when Sakya Trizin came to the United States, there were a lot of women who were interested in Tibetan Buddhism, like myself. And so we're asking, well, what about the women lamas? And Geshe Rinpoche too heard this from all these women. If everything is equal, you can all become liberated. There's absolutely no difference between the genders. We're not meeting the women lamas. Where are they? So Sakya Trizin went to Jetsun Kusho. He said, I think you should start teaching. There's a lot of women interested in Tibetan Buddhism, and they would very much like to study under a woman's lama. And since you're a householder, also you'll understand their problems more than the rest of us. And so by that time, Sakya Trizin had established 4 or 5 Sakya centers in the United States. and then a few other places. And so she would go periodically, but she gave more initiations than too many teachings. And of course, any Lama, they always hear the problems of their students. She got to know Westerners very, very well. She's always ready to help and give advice, but she's kind of no nonsense. She'll tell you very directly if she thinks something is feasible or not feasible. And she also gives information in a very short way, so it's not complicated. It's easy to remember, and if you follow it, it usually will be to your advantage. And so she started teaching, and she taught so many places. She established this wonderful retreat center in San Juan Islands, Washington State. Unfortunately, now they're selling the property, but for decades, it was one of the only retreat place for the Sakyas, really, that people could go constantly. And a lot of times there, she would give Vajrayogini teachings, as well as Tara retreats and Vajrayogini retreats. So Jetsun Kushok has a life that's, I feel, in many ways, much more difficult than Sakya Trinley had to adapt to, because first India, as you mentioned, and then Canada. But all of us who have studied under Jetsun Kushok, we're very, very grateful for who she is and how she has helped us so much in many different ways.
I see the benefit tremendously, especially being a woman householder. So she had to kind of go through that grueling experience to be able to be of benefit in the West.
Yeah, she had a job. She had to manage 3 boys. She said they were all good boys, Lujin Ken. So he stayed behind in India, but still, even raising 2 boys is quite a lot when your English is not so good.
Yeah, especially also coming from this totally intact world, not even just the tradition spiritually, but a householder tradition, the way the house is run. And it was so organized and so held, and tremendous belonging from every direction. And then to be dropped into 2 totally different realities. I mean, plus even the process of exiling and all the violence there.
Yeah, this really shows the foundation of the practice. Everybody was upset and depressed and wondering about the people they left behind and what was going to happen. But in another way, she always has this mind that's very level. It's a very level mind. She doesn't get perturbed that easy about anything. She lives in a very non-dual way, which I had this tiny glimpse of this one day. I was interviewing her, and suddenly the phone rang, and I knew, the way she reacted, that she had to answer, because sometimes when I interviewed her, she completely disregarded the phone. But this one, you could tell she was waiting for this phone call. So she picks it up, she gets this information that she was waiting for, and then she stops. It was, I don't know, maybe a minute or 2 minutes, but I felt she went someplace, completely went someplace. I don't know where she went, but she went someplace. And then she came back, just like as if nothing happened. So then I asked her, I said, would you like to stop the interview? And she goes, no, it's fine. I'm going to take care of it tonight. And that was that. Later, I found out that one of her practitioners had just passed away. And she knew that this practitioner was dying, and she wanted to be informed when she died. And I'm sure she did something in that minute or two to help that practitioner, but it was all silent. And then she came back, and then we did the interview again, And I think for the majority of us, we would not be able to cope so easily like that and have that kind of strength of mind.
Her body was still there, but her awareness, or she was doing a practice for them, or
Yeah, I think so. I never asked her directly because it's impolite, but that was my sense.
So how has the role of Jetsunmas in modern day shifted and stayed the same in terms of responsibilities, practice commitments, and lifestyles? What do you think?
I haven't followed too much the young Jetsumas, except for the oldest daughter of the 42nd Sakya Trinley, Ratnavadra's oldest daughter, Jetsunma Chungwa Trinley Palter, who was born in 2007. I think she's going to be another outstanding Jetsuma. her abilities are already quite incredible because she knows Hindi, English, Chinese, and Tibetan. And then she was going to Western schools, so she would have a Western education, as well as being trained by her grandfather, Sakya Trizin, her father, Ratnavajra, in the traditional ways. So she's being grounded to handle quite a lot of situations that will probably arise in her life. The Vajrakilaya, this important deity, which involves a Lama dance that you have to do very, very intricate steps. No Jetsunma was trained for Vajrakilaya, even though the men, all the sons, it was kind of a rite of passage to do the Vajrakilaya Lama dance, the meditative dance. Now, for Jetsun Kushok, during that time when Sakya Trizin was learning, she helped him practice. So she knew how to do it. And she performed it once, only in 1959 after they escaped. But that was it. It was an exception. But this young Jetsunma, she performed it publicly with her father, plus many other monks. It's a very, very big gathering, but I think she opened the doors now that the Jetsunmas can also learn the Vajrakilaya dance and perform equally like the sons. I don't think there's any more labrangs. I think she stays in the palace, then she's traveling and she gives teachings, like mostly more small initiations, like long life initiations. But she's doing all this at a young age and she's getting trained very well. And she didn't have to become a nun. And so, since she really insisted to become a nun, they gave her the nun vows. But I don't know about the other Jetsumas.
Does she have the same practice immersion path as the previous Jetsunmas? Is she practicing at that kind of intensity that pre-1959 Jetsunmas?
I think less. And I don't know how many years ago I was asking if she did a retreat. But at that time, she had not done a retreat. But now I know she has done some retreats. But I don't know if she's done the Hivadri retreat. These are things too that are a little bit private because they feel that you shouldn't talk about these things because obstacles can arise. So you might learn about these things after the fact.
Now there's a new system of succession for the Sakya lineage that was devised in 2017 into 3-year terms. And why did this shift occur? And does it affect the Jetsunmas at all?
I don't think it affected the Jetsumas, but at the time, Dr. Rinpoche, who was in Seattle, he was still alive. And I think Sakya Trizin and Dr. Rinpoche conferred. Sakya Trizin has 2 sons, and Dr. Rinpoche has sons, but given the circumstances since they came in, I think 1961 to the United States, they had to struggle financially and everything, that none of the sons were trained in these intensive spiritual practices. But he has 3 grandsons who have completely been trained in these spiritual practices that Sakya Trizin and Dr. Rinpoche thought, let them become Sakya Trizins, let them understand the responsibilities and what they have to do, and we can guide them while we're still alive. So that was their motivation about changing at that time. And then they based it on the Nor monastery, labrangs, that everything changes every 3 years. And so Ratnavajra was the first, Sakya Trizin, the 42nd, and he had a little bit longer term because of COVID. And then right now is the 43rd Sakya Trizin, which is the second son of Sakya Trizin. Yeah.
Pre-2017, it would have gone like Sakya Trizin, the 41st, he would stay in that role until his future passing, and then there'd be the next Sakya Trizin. That's traditionally how it went.
Traditionally, the Sakya Trizin has to die before the next Sakya Trizin is selected.
I'm so curious about some of the photos in here that you have.
This is an interesting story that I just found out about a week ago. You know, the cover, I love this cover. Jetsun Kushok, I didn't mention, she's a photographer. A lot of these noble families learned how to take photos and develop photo. And she learned this from her cousin from Sikkim. And I had asked her if she had photographs. She told me she has negatives, but she never showed me these negatives ever. But this woman reached out to my friend and she said, I'd like to contact Elisabeth Benard. So my friend gave me her email and I reached out to her and she said that she had taken my book to Jetsun Kushok and she was the first in line and she showed the book. Jetsun Kushok said, oh, I developed that photo. And she had never told me that she developed this photo. She said a monk took the photo, but I developed the photo. So she must have set up the whole thing and knew what she wanted. And now it's become part of her documentation. And then it turns out just by chance that a lot of these photos were taken by women.
So what are some of the notable relationships that Jetsunmas had with the same generation, within their own generation, and then between generations? Like, will you speak on their particular lineage?
Tamdrin Wangmo, she's the teacher of Pema Trinlei. So there's a direct transmission between the great aunt and the great niece in that way. And that was pretty much sustained until Tamdrin Wangmo passed away. And then with Jetsun Kushok, she's surrounded by women practitioners who are her relatives. There's the aunt who's the great practitioner. There's her paternal aunts that some of them either live in the palace or live in the labrangs nearby, and they're great practitioners too. She had a lot of female role models, so to speak, to help her and to emulate in that way. And now the young Jetsunma Kunga, Trinlei, Palter, and Jetsun Kushok, sometimes they work together and they go to nunneries and they help the nuns. So those are some of the bonds between the women in the Sakya family.